The Wilsons were a typical young family, living in the suburbs with their two daughters, Emily, 10, and Sophie, 8. The house was modest but cozy, a place filled with the sound of laughter and the occasional sibling squabble. Life was good, predictable even, until the night everything changed. It began innocently enough. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson had been planning a rare night out, a trip to the cinema for their anniversary. They were excited but needed someone to watch the girls. After flipping through the local newspaper, they came across an ad for a babysitter with stellar recommendations and affordable rates. It seemed perfect. The babysitter arrived promptly at 6 p.m. Her name was Margaret, a tall woman in her late 40s with a calm demeanor. She wore long sleeves and gloves despite the warm weather, her hair tied back tightly. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, and she smiled often. But there was something unsettling about her appearance. Beneath the edges of her gloves and at the collar of her blouse, faint scars crisscrossed her skin. Emily and Sophie noticed immediately. "Why does she have so many scars?" Emily whispered to Sophie as they peeked at her from the kitchen doorway. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her voice trembling. "Do you think she's dangerous?" The girls had always been curious about ghost stories, but one tale in particular haunted them. It was about the ghost of a nanny who had been brutally beaten to death by an angry father after failing to protect his child. Her spirit, it was said, wandered the earth, seeking vengeance on children. The girls had heard the story many times, and now, staring at Margaret's scars, they couldn't help but wonder. The girls begged their parents not to leave them alone with her. "Please don't go," Sophie cried. "We'll be good. We don't need a babysitter." But their parents laughed it off. "Don't be silly," Mrs. Wilson said. "Margaret has excellent reviews. You'll have fun." As the door closed behind their parents, Margaret turned to the girls with a wide smile. "Now let's have some fun, shall we?" she said. At first, the evening was uneventful. Margaret cooked the girls' dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. She helped them with their homework and even told them a bedtime story about a brave knight and a wicked witch. For a while, Emily and Sophie almost forgot their fears. Margaret seemed normal, even kind. But as the night went on, strange things began to happen. While brushing their teeth, Emily noticed something odd in the bathroom mirror. A faint, shadowy figure flickered behind her for just a moment. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Did you see that?" she asked Sophie, her voice shaking. "See what?" Sophie replied, her face pale. I don't know. Maybe nothing." When it was time for bed, Margaret tucked them in and turned off the lights, leaving the door slightly ajar. "Sweet dreams," she said softly. The girls lay in silence for a long time. The house felt unnaturally quiet. The ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down their spines. Sophie was the first to speak. "Do you think she's the ghost?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know. She doesn't seem like a ghost. But the scars," Sophie whispered. "And the way she looks at us." "Let's just sleep," Emily said, pulling the blanket over her head. But neither of them could sleep. Hours passed, and the air in the room grew heavy. It was then that Emily heard it, a faint creaking sound, like someone slowly walking down the hallway. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. The creaking grew louder, closer. She nudged Sophie awake, placing a finger to her lips to keep her quiet. Together, they stared at the partially open door. That's when they saw it. A figure moved past the doorway, slow and deliberate. It was luminous, its outline glowing faintly in the dark. The shape was unmistakable. It was Margaret. But something was different. Her body seemed distorted, her movements jerky and unnatural. And in her hand, she held something long and dark. It glinted faintly in the dim light. "It's the belt," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one from the story." Emily's mind raced. The belt, the scars, the glowing figure. It all fit the story. Margaret wasn't just a strange babysitter. She was the ghost. The figure paused just outside their door, its head tilting slightly as if listening. Emily and Sophie held their breath, their small bodies trembling under the blankets. The door creaked open further, and the glowing figure stepped inside. Her face was no longer calm and kind. It was twisted with rage, her scars glowing red as if freshly carved into her skin. "You shouldn't have looked," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. Without thinking, Emily grabbed Sophie's hand. "We have to go," she whispered. The girls leaped from their beds and ran to the window. It was a small drop to the ground, just one story, but it was their only chance. Emily unlocked the window and pushed it open as quietly as she could. The cold night air hit them like a wave, but they didn't hesitate. Sophie climbed out first, landing awkwardly on the grass below. Emily followed, her foot slipping on the sill, but she managed to catch herself. They hit the ground running, sprinting toward the street. Behind them, they could hear the creak of the floorboards as the ghostly figure followed. Her whispers grew louder, turning into a low, guttural wail. "Run faster!" Sophie cried. They didn't stop until they reached the sidewalk. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent. For a moment they thought they were safe. But then they saw her. Margaret stood in the front yard, her glowing figure flickering like a dying flame. In her hand, the belt swung lazily, the metal plate catching the moonlight. The girls screamed and ran again, their small legs carrying them as far from the house as they could go. The next morning, the Wilsons returned to find the house eerily quiet. The girls' beds were empty, the window wide open. Panic set in as they searched the neighborhood, calling their names. Hours later, their bodies were found in their beds. The police were baffled. There was no sign of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. The only clue was the window, which had been left open. But the Wilsons knew the truth. They could feel it in the cold air that lingered in the house, in the faint creaking of the floorboards at night, and in the whispering wind that seemed to call their daughters' names. Margaret was never seen again. The newspaper ad disappeared, and no one ever came forward to claim responsibility for what happened. But every so often, in the quiet hours of the night, a faint, ghostly figure can be seen wandering the halls of the Wilsons' house, her belt swinging lazily at her side. And her whispers are always the same: "You shouldn't have looked." Weeks had passed since the tragedy, but the Wilsons could not bring themselves to stay in the house for long. The once cozy home now felt hollow, its walls suffocating in their silence. The beds were stripped bare, the girls' toys untouched, and the windows remained tightly shut. Mrs. Wilson often found herself standing in the empty room that had once belonged to Emily and Sophie. She would stare out the window, searching for some sign, any clue as to how her girls could have disappeared into the night, only to be found dead in their own beds the next morning. The coroner's report had given no explanation, only a chilling phrase: "Cause of death unknown." Mr. Wilson, desperate for closure, hired a private investigator to look into the mysterious babysitter. But there was no record of Margaret in the agency's files. The phone number from the ad in the newspaper was disconnected. It was as if she had never existed. But the strangest thing was the newspaper itself. When Mr. Wilson retrieved it from the recycling bin to check the ad again, the page with the babysitter listing was gone, torn cleanly out, leaving only a jagged edge. One night, while sitting in the kitchen nursing a cup of tea, Mrs. Wilson heard it, the faint creak of floorboards coming from the girls' room. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it, but then it came again, louder this time. "Paul," she whispered, shaking her husband awake. "Paul, someone's in the house." They crept toward the room, their hearts pounding. The door was ajar, and as they pushed it open, they froze. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and there, standing by the window, was a figure, a tall, glowing figure. The figure didn't move at first, its back turned to the Wilsons. It stood motionless, staring out the window, its pale, glowing outline radiating a soft light that illuminated the room. Mrs. Wilson let out an involuntary gasp, and the figure turned its head slowly toward them. It was Margaret. Her scarred face was twisted in a cold smile, and in her hand, she held the same belt with the iron plate. The Wilsons couldn't move, frozen in place as her glowing eyes locked onto theirs. "You shouldn't have left them," Margaret whispered, her voice soft but filled with malice. Mr. Wilson grabbed his wife's hand and pulled her backward, slamming the door shut. They ran downstairs, fumbling for their phones, but neither could get a signal. The house grew colder with every passing second, the air thick with a suffocating stillness. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder and more distinct. You shouldn't have left them. You shouldn't have left them. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the house. Mrs. Wilson clutched her husband's arm. "Paul, what do we do?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We leave," he said firmly, grabbing the car keys. "Now." But as they approached the front door, it slammed shut on its own, the deadbolt clicking into place. The Wilsons tried every door and window in the house, but none of them would budge. It was as if the house itself had come alive, trapping them within its walls. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening chorus. In the living room, the television flickered on by itself, showing static. Slowly, an image began to take shape on the screen. It was the girls' room. Emily and Sophie were lying in their beds, their faces pale and lifeless. And standing between them was Margaret, her glowing figure flickering like a dying flame. She turned to face the camera, her red eyes burning with hatred, and pointed directly at the screen. "She's watching us," Mrs. Wilson whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. Then, from upstairs, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the staircase. "She's coming," Mr. Wilson said, his voice barely audible. They ran to the kitchen, barricading the door with chairs and the heavy oak table. But it didn't matter. The footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. And then they stopped. The kitchen door creaked open. Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her glowing form casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Her scarred face was expressionless now, but her eyes burned with fury. "You left them," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You left them with me." "We didn't know," Mrs. Wilson sobbed. "We didn't know who you were." Margaret tilted her head, studying them. "You didn't care. You left them behind. Just like the others." "The others?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice shaking. Margaret's form flickered, and for a moment, the room around them changed. They were no longer in their home but in an old, decaying house. The walls were covered in dark stains, and the floor was littered with broken toys and tiny shoes. "They all left," Margaret said, her voice distant. "All the parents. They trusted me, and when they came back, they blamed me. They beat me. They killed me. And now I make them pay." The house shifted back to its normal state, and Margaret's glowing figure loomed over them. "Please," Mrs. Wilson begged. "We'll do anything. Just let us go." Margaret smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "There is one way." Margaret extended her hand, and the belt she held dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The smoke swirled around the Wilsons, wrapping around their wrists and ankles like chains. "You will stay," Margaret said. "This house needs caretakers. And I need company." "No," Mr. Wilson said, shaking his head. "We can't." "You will," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "You left your daughters. Now you will never leave them again." The chains tightened, pulling the Wilsons to their knees. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was Margaret's glowing figure, her red eyes blazing with triumph. When the police arrived days later, they found the house empty. The Wilsons were gone, along with all their belongings. But in the girls' room, the beds were neatly made, and on the wall, scrawled in faint, childlike handwriting, were the words, "You shouldn't have left them." The new family had brushed off the first strange incident with the baby monitor as a technical glitch. After all, old houses often had quirks, and what harm could a faint whisper do? But as the days turned into nights, the strangeness escalated. One evening, as Claire, the new mother, sat in the living room folding baby clothes, she heard a soft creak from upstairs. It was rhythmic, like the slow opening and closing of a door. She froze, her hands clutching a tiny onesie, her ears straining to catch the sound again. Creak, creak. Her husband, Adam, was in the garage, working on assembling the baby's new crib. "Adam," she called out, hoping he had come inside without her hearing. No answer. She hesitated for a moment, then climbed the stairs. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and quiet. The baby's room was at the far end, and the door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as though someone had just pushed it open. Claire's heart pounded as she approached the room. "Hello," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is someone there?" She reached the doorway and peered inside. The room was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight shaped like a moon. Her baby was fast asleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The door had stopped moving. With a sigh of relief, Claire turned to leave, but then she saw it. The reflection in the window, standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the faint light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and covered in faint scars. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though studying her. Claire spun around, but there was nothing there. The corner of the room was empty. Her blood ran cold. She hurried back downstairs, clutching the baby monitor in her trembling hands. When Adam came inside a few minutes later, she told him what she'd seen, her voice shaking. "It's this house," she said. "Something's wrong with it." Adam, ever the skeptic, brushed it off. "You're just tired, Claire. Moving has been stressful. Why don't you go lie down? I'll keep an eye on things." Reluctantly, she agreed. But as she lay in bed, the whispers began again. This time they were louder. "You shouldn't have left them." Downstairs, Adam was cleaning up when the lights flickered. He looked up, frowning, and muttered, "Cheap wiring." But then the temperature dropped suddenly, and his breath came out in a white mist. He turned around and froze. The figure was standing at the bottom of the stairs, its glowing red eyes locked onto his. In its hand was a belt, the iron plate gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Who are you?" Adam stammered, backing away. The figure didn't answer. It raised the belt, its movements slow and deliberate. Behind it, Adam saw the shadows in the room shift and ripple, as though they were alive. He stumbled backward, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The figure stepped closer, its voice echoing in a guttural whisper. "You shouldn't have left them." Adam scrambled to his feet and ran upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind him. "Claire, we need to leave now," he shouted. But when he turned around, Claire wasn't in bed. She was standing by the window, her back to him, her head tilted slightly, just like the figure in the corner of the baby's room. "Claire," he said, his voice trembling. She turned slowly, and Adam's stomach dropped. Her eyes were glowing red. "You shouldn't have left them," she whispered, her voice overlapping with the guttural, inhuman tones of the figure downstairs. The baby monitor on the nightstand crackled to life, and a childlike voice whispered through the static. "You shouldn't have left them." The last thing Adam saw before the lights went out was Claire lunging toward him, her hands clawing at his chest.